Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the anatomy of a pen test. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here. I know many of you are still trying to get logged into the call, so while you do that, we'll cover a few housekeeping items. All participants will be placed on mute, but please feel free to unmute yourself during the Q&A section at the end of this presentation if you would like to ask your question out loud. However, if you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and submit those to us in the questions box, and we'll answer those as best as we can throughout the presentation. I know the question you all are wanting to know most urgently is whether or not this webinar will be recorded, and the answer to that is yes. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out along with the slide deck within the next day or two. So if you're looking for that, please check your email in the next day or two and we'll make sure to get you all of those materials. Finally, we always like to know how we're doing, so please make sure to fill out the quick survey after the webinar. We do look at all of your responses and use that feedback to craft our webinars in the future, so we really appreciate any feedback that you're willing to give us. Well, without any further ado, let me go ahead and pass it over to Parker Brissett, and he'll introduce the topic as well as himself. Parker,
Thank you, Gabby. Yeah, I appreciate everyone coming. Today we're diving into the anatomy of the pen test. Now, this isn't a technical deep dive into all the different nuances of technology that's at play here, but this is a general approach for any industry, for any organization when it comes to penetration testing. These are the things to consider. These are the things to generally understand. So as we go through this, if anything pops up, there should be a little chat box that you can drop some questions into, and we can make this a bit of Q&A as we're going through. Towards the end, we'll definitely have a little bit of time set aside to answer any more specific questions, but feel free to ask those in the chat as we're going through this. We're going to cover 6 primary areas, and we like to make it pretty simple of the what, where, how, why, when, and who. And these can give us a good sense of the broad spectrum of a penetration test and all of the lovely components tied into it. As mentioned earlier, I'm Parker Brissett. I'm one of our senior advisors and vCISO for many of our customers here at Ritchie May. I have been in the industry for nearly 20 years at this point, working with cybersecurity technology, and I've got a broad spectrum of organizations that I've worked with, going from fintech to banking, insurance, healthcare, media and entertainment, and my primary focus when it comes to cybersecurity is enabling business growth. Cybersecurity is an important part of being able to continue operations, continue to build trust with customers, and grow your organization. And any perspective that I take on cybersecurity is to translate what the book says on cybersecurity to make sure it's most relevant for your organization. And you'll see some of that come through as we discuss the anatomy of a pen test and its benefits to your organization. As we get started here, we've got a poll question that is going to pop up for you. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute to answer that question.
This will just give us an idea of where you all are at as we go through the presentation today. This is the one and only quick poll question that you'll have to answer. It looks like we have most of our votes in, so I'll give it about 5 more seconds and then we'll close this out. Looking at those results, it looks like many of us know what a penetration test is. However, we still have a lot of questions. So that is exactly what we would expect and why we're here today. So I'll go ahead and close this out. Parker can keep on answering all those questions.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for providing your response there. It is always helpful to know what our audience has in terms of experience, and we're going to jump into it. So we're starting with the what. What is a pen test? Typically, this is what my mom thinks a pen test is, that we're clicking pens, making sure they're working across the board. In reality, my skills are more on the keyboard when it comes to penetration testing. So efficient, I can do it with my toes. There's a couple of areas when we're talking about what is a penetration test that are defined by various organizations such as the NYDFS, the New York Department of Financial Services, PCI DSS, NIST, and the Center for Internet Security. These are the common bodies of information and regulation that do define what a pen test is. So broadly, they're generally discussing the same concepts. There's various ways to apply these specifics around the definitions here. I won't read every single definition for you, but the common themes that we have across these is we're looking to simulate real world attacks. So with permission, the ethical hacker can actually step in and emulate what we know to be the common tactics and techniques of malicious hackers. So by simulating their attacks, we're able to identify weaknesses that can be patched or fixed or remediated in different ways. The pen test is attempting to circumvent any of your security measures that you do have in place. So it's really testing any controls that you do have. So any technology that you've made an investment in that says it's supposed to keep your applications or your website or your infrastructure, your network secure, the pen test really pushes those to the limit to make sure those are secure. Also, it's testing the effectiveness, and it's really, really up to date in terms of what we're seeing with present attacks. So the simulations are going to be absolutely what you could see in the active threat environment. We're able to identify various weaknesses as well through that, and that's kind of the common theme of what a penetration test entails. What is not a penetration test? Now, you would not believe how broad people apply the term penetration test. Things like vulnerability scanning, vulnerability assessments, maturity assessments, those are not penetration tests. Those are not simulating real world activities. And even in the cybersecurity field, some people get this confused, that a vulnerability scan is the equivalent of a penetration test. When it comes to penetration testing, there's no real automating. You've got certain functions that can provide you with results. A vulnerability scan is a part of a penetration test, but it takes a real person to actively exploit vulnerabilities that are found and test those systems to their limits. So that's a common misconception. A penetration test, you keep using that term. I do not think it means what you think it means. That's Inigo Montoya for you, one of my favorite movies, The Princess Bride. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I've got a sick kid knocking on my door. One second. Thank you for that brief interruption. My wife and I both happen to have meetings happening at the same time. So we'll jump into the next section here on the where. Where are we actually doing these tests? When it comes to a different enterprise environment, there's different ways that we perform your penetration test. There's different items that you have from a technology perspective that provides various openings and opportunities for hackers to get in, both ethical hackers and malicious hackers. So we like to make sure we're really comprehensive of where we're looking for potential points of entry, exploitability in different areas. That includes your internal and external network. So often organizations will have the inside of the network where computers can talk inside from computer to computer or computers to your servers to your network storage and file services. So running a penetration test from the inside does give you a good example of real world scenario of your end user devices and your employees' devices being exploited and what that can look like. External is the most common type of penetration test where it's looking for your public footprint of technology. Where are the holes? These things are constantly being analyzed and bombarded by malicious attackers, so it's important to make sure your external surface is covered with a penetration test. Web applications and various types of application penetration testing, this can again apply in different elements of how much you have, whether you have any development at all. You can also test some of your suppliers' applications for potential vulnerabilities. And we look at the API integrations. We can also penetration test Internet of Things devices. These are the common things that you might find in your house. These are also sometimes common in offices and different places to present a display of important office information. Mobile applications, you can do penetration tests on your wireless internet. We can do that for your router at home. We can do that for your enterprise wireless routers. We also look at your cloud environment. So anything that you've got out there, we can do a penetration test on, and that's important to consider every location and area that you do have technology. There's a important area that falls under the penetration testing scope of the human element. That comes down to commonly known as social engineering. That is testing the limits of personnel and their susceptibility to social engineering tactics. A fun activity that I get to participate in is a physical penetration test, and that involves impersonating employees or a service worker or someone to get into your office and potentially access more systems or files or anything in that environment. So if you do have a physical location and you want to test the physical systems and their susceptibility to being exploited, a physical penetration test would cover that for you. There's the emerging tech side and specialties with blockchain and AI technology that are also available to run penetration testing for. This is the full gambit of where you can do a test. So if you have any of these situations in your environment, that's where you can be thinking of, when is the last time we did a wireless test? How secure is that? And that's why we like to cover this broad area of where, so that you can start thinking about your own environment and where you might want to identify gaps. Now we switch into the how. This is a bit more of the technical side of items here, but there's multiple styles that we apply in terms of conducting these penetration tests. So you may hear the term red team, covert, or blind testing. And what this is no one but the person or handful of people that authorize the penetration test are aware that the penetration test is running. This can be really, really useful for testing your security capabilities. So it identifies whether your monitoring controls are working, whether your alerting is actually effective. Because if you can't detect a red team running their penetration test, you can't detect a real malicious hacker that's also circumventing your controls. So this really should focus on your ability to respond to these things, and that's primarily what it's testing. It's not necessarily testing what vulnerabilities and exploitable holes that you have in your environment. This is a little bit of the people element as well. For those more seasoned security professionals and security environments, this is really helpful to make sure that you've got a live scenario testing your response capabilities. We also do a purple team. So this is a combination of red team and blue team efforts. Typically, when we're talking about blue team, we're talking about the opposite side of a red team. Your blue team is the security team. It's the response to threats. It's your defensive team, where your red team is the more offensive team. So the purple team blends this together. So as the red team is performing their attacks, they're working with the blue team to make sure, hey, did you see this? Did you notice that we did this? Okay, looks like there's a gap. Let's see what we can do to address that while we're in the middle of this scenario. So this is a real fun exercise to have your red team, blue team actively working together as things are going on in your environment. The black box testing is a very common element. The black box means that all we really know is the scope of targets, right? So your external network, your IP addresses, the URLs and web addresses that you have, you give us that information and you say, hey, this is what we want you to test. Good luck figuring out what all of these things are. So we don't know your environment. We don't know what kind of technology that you have. So we don't know what we're testing. This is the truest form of simulating what an outside attacker would have access to and the information that would be available to an outside attacker. So this is the closest thing to that real world experience. Now, what we also like to do is add other forms of the penetration testing by doing something like a gray box. You will provide us with some knowledge of your environment, provide us with an account that is registered with your application so that we can be a registered user and attempt exploitation having authentication into your application. So those are some of the smaller elements where you give us a little bit, we get a little bit of knowledge, you tell us some of the technology that you do have in place so that we can better prepare a more targeted attack to simulate what may be exposable in your environment. The white box approach is an assumed breach approach. So this is full access, full knowledge, full documentation. We're acting as an admin, and it's assuming that the black box, gray box activities have happened. The malicious attacker has entered your environment and is currently inside of your environment exploiting things. This is really, really helpful to ensure that any of the extra controls you have in place are really effective once somebody gains authorization into your system. At the point that somebody does gain access and does have those privileged accounts, that's when things get the worst for you. So by doing a white box test, you can really, really assure yourself that you've got the right controls in place and identify gaps where you may need to make some more investments. So moving from the styles into this penetration test phase. So we like to approach this consistent model, and this is the common approach and defined through a lot of bodies of information and items like NIST, or organizations like NIST or the Center for Internet Security provide this layout of what we understand attackers do in order to actually get to exploitation. So we gather intelligence on your environment, we model some threats that may be applicable, we do some analysis on the vulnerabilities, and then we exploit. After we've exploited, we do some post-exploitation activities such as gaining persistence in your environment or exfiltrating data. Then you'll get your report with your remediation recommendations. You complete those, and then we can test it again. So it's always important to think about your penetration test in this secular method. That's where I was going. The planning phase, this is our information gathering, right? So your malicious attackers are also doing this. So it's important that a element of your penetration test has outside intelligence gathering. So performing some recon on your environment, utilizing open source intelligence techniques to find more publicly available information. This can be search engines. There's a fun thing called Google dorking, which you can put specific commands into a Google search that will search a website for PDF files. It'll search it for potential admin files that may be exposed publicly. This also includes some social media engagement where we may look at LinkedIn and see who your developers are. And if their developers list the languages that they're most efficient in, that gives us a point to target, and we can bring some knowledge into the engagement before we actually start penetrating. We'll look at dark web data leaks. So if passwords have been dumped for people that are in your organization, we want to go and test, hey, are these passwords still in place, or are they reusing these passwords across different areas? And we'll just continue to dive in and gather more information from there. Threat modeling allows us to kind of craft more effective test scenarios when running a penetration test. So once we've gathered all of the information from the first phase, we're going to start looking at, all right, where are we able to best leverage our tool set, our expertise and technology, and how can we model an approach to fully attack these things? So that allows us to prioritize our attack scenarios, because oftentimes a penetration test with an ethical hacker is time bound and time constrained. However, a malicious attacker doesn't necessarily have those time constraints. So they can spend more time without prioritizing. So the penetration testing approach, by being able to prioritize, allows us to get really specific and move more effectively. So that really does enhance what we have available to us in order of exploiting in an efficient manner. Vulnerability analysis is really helpful. You know, we talked about what's not a penetration test. Vulnerability scanning, it's not the full penetration test. It's one tiny phase in this complete phase. So automated tools will scan your systems, help us identify things, save us some time, and make us more efficient, and tell us more information about your system and provide us with specifics about what is exploitable potentially. It also provides some fingerprinting of your environment. It can tell us different things that it knows from its database of what the system might be. So it may be able to tell us, hey, this server is running Apache, or this is a Windows 11 device. So that gives us some more information to know what we could potentially test on that specific target. So very important to analyze those vulnerabilities before moving into the exploitation phase. The exploitation phase, honestly, is the most fun phase if you're a penetration tester. This is where you really get to test your skills at actually exploiting the various items that you've identified as potential vulnerabilities. This is where we start to actually poke holes through your security controls and gain access to systems that you don't want malicious attackers to have access to. This is the hands-on portion, or toes-on portion, if you recall from earlier. These are the most impactful and critical elements of any findings that go into a penetration test report. You're really looking at what was exploitable, because that's the most critical to resolve at any point that you do get your penetration test report. That's a priority for most organizations. Once we do get that exploitation done and we're in your environment, we're gonna poke around a little bit more. So we're gonna see if all of that open source and outside intelligence can be leveraged to gain more access, can be leveraged to step into a different part of your environment. So we may have found one tiny hole in your cloud environment that allowed us to access a server, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to now go back to that vulnerability analysis and that information and intelligence gathering. We've got a new source of information that we can get access to, and a new phase in this that gives us access to more of your environment. The exploration of your network allows a penetration tester to extend their attack and, again, simulate what you would see in the real world. The final items around how we complete a penetration test from the ethical side is reporting. You want to know what we found. You want to know what was exploitable. You want to get your recommendations from the security experts on how to resolve these things. Without a report, it's useless. It's just an activity. It's not going to really benefit you. So always focus on the level of detail that you get in your reporting. If you're working with any penetration tester, get some sample reports so you know what to expect, so you can see, are you going to get value from the report that you get. Remediation is where your team steps in. The penetration tester has gone through, analyzed everything, exploited everything that they could within the time frame they had, and given you specific recommendations for resolving the findings. The remediation is the most important part, because if you run a penetration test and you don't remediate your findings, that was a waste of a penetration test. You actually have to move forward with resolving some of these things and preventing exploitation in the future. Once you do remediate those things, you want to retest them. You want to validate, hey, that hole you found earlier, did we fix it? Is it repaired? This is an important element that some organizations can overlook. They can just go through and apply remediation and make the assumption that they're good, but this can uncover any new vulnerabilities that were introduced after your remediation. And it does really validate that the controls you are putting in place, the fixes that you're putting in place, are actually working. When you get a report from any organization, ethical hacker, there are some critical must-haves. The executive summary. This is going to get real specific on the recommendations of your highest level risk and impacts to your organization. This also is useful for explaining to other business owners what may have been found without overwhelming them in detailed findings. So an executive summary should always expect in any penetration test that you get a report on. The methodology and scoping, also very important. If you don't understand what the scope was of what was tested, you don't necessarily know that the test you wanted was actually what you got. The methodology that's applied also provides you with some better insights into what could have been tested and the approach that the penetration tester utilized. So as you get more and more of these, you can kind of glean some information about methodology and make sure that you're getting what you expect by understanding the methodology a little bit more. You can see that within your report. The key findings and attack scenarios, you've got to have that. If you're not getting how the exploit happened with the full description of step 1 to step 400, whatever that is, if you don't have that entire scenario played out for you, it becomes difficult to understand what the actual vulnerability might be, what you actually are looking to resolve. Because sometimes we can present a specific finding and a specific recommendation or remediation. However, as a result of you seeing the full attack scenario, you may then be able to pivot into, actually, let's move to a new technology. Rather than fixing one specific item, we can see that there's potentially a broader scope of vulnerabilities or inefficiencies in our environment. So penetration test reporting can help shine a light on some of those areas. You do want those detailed findings. They should have things like the rating for the vulnerability. There's the common vulnerability scoring system that's out there. There's multiple other ways to rate a vulnerability. This kind of gives you some more information about the larger risk to your business. These scores are based on real world activity. Are we seeing a lot of people exploiting this? Are we seeing this as an easy thing to exploit? And so with a higher score, that can help you analyze the information without having to fully understand all the details. It gives you a clear layout of what you may want to fix first. So understanding the impact, that should be in your detailed findings. Any evidence of screenshots and items like that absolutely should be in your report. You should also get references to outside sources of why this should be fixed, or specifics of how the manufacturer may recommend fixing this. So be looking for those references. It's very helpful information to make sure you have in any report that you receive. Appendices around system information and the tools that we utilize are very helpful for you to understand where we did find specific things on specific hosts. So that way you know, oh, this specific computer is the problem, and we see the information so we can go identify it within our environment. These reporting must-haves are what you should definitely be looking for in any penetration test that you receive. As we move on into the why even get a penetration test? What is the actual benefit around this? More often than not, compliance is a huge driver for any organization to get a penetration test. This is regulated by various bodies and legal requirements in different areas. The standards that your organization may align with, things like PCI, things like ISO 27001, things like SOC 2, things like NYDFS. I could throw a whole alphabet soup at you of different compliance and regulatory bodies that are focused on making sure you get a penetration test, making sure you are simulating real world in exploitation and attacks. This is a huge driver because there are serious consequences, whether it's from a regulation that can fine you and the Attorney General assesses that, hey, you've not done what is required or expected of you. This also can lead to a loss of business. You may have various clients that require these specifics, and if they're not performed, you may lose that engagement with them. The big item that the security personnel love to focus on is the increased security posture. So by understanding your environment and identifying your weaknesses, you're able to create a more secure organization. A more secure organization means that you're operating more effectively, means that you're operating longer, means that specific events and different incidents aren't as impactful to your organization. So increasing your security posture is a big reason why we like to make sure all of our clients are getting their penetration tests on a regular cadence. The other element is confidence. You gain some confidence, you get to sleep a little bit better at night knowing that you've run these tests, you've closed these holes. This is huge for customers and for various engagements that you have with investors potentially, so that you can provide them with the confidence that you are addressing any weaknesses in your technology. There's often this approach of, hey, we think we've got the full suit of armor here, and there's no way at all that we could be exploited. But the offensive security test is going to find that one little hole that's most impactful to your organization. So testing this is super important because it'll find those small little gaps, the chinks in the armor that can be detrimental. So we talked a little bit about compliance requirements. There are specific requirements laid out of you absolutely have to do this when we're talking about PCI DSS, FISMA, NYDFS, NERC-CIP, CIS, CMMC. There's a laundry list of alphabet soup here that is requiring this. There are other compliance requirements that are strongly recommending it. HIPAA, GDPR, ISO, NIST, SOX, GLBA, any of those elements strongly recommend it, and more often than not, auditors will flag a finding under these requirements, even though it is recommended. It's almost fully expected in the compliance landscape. So when do we test? This is at least annually, and that's typically what you see in most environments. We highly recommend a quarterly penetration test so that you can segment it and ensure your posture is continuously improving. Vulnerabilities are released every single day. Items that are exploitable are constantly being released and found by both ethical hackers and malicious hackers. So I can't tell you how many emails I get in a week from different sources saying, hey, there's this new exploit in Google Chrome. There's this new exploit in Windows environments, and there's always something changing. So the more frequently you're doing your testing, the more confidence you can gain in your security posture. Anytime you've got a major software change, especially to your applications, you definitely want to run a new penetration test. If you're adding new technology, you want to test that those configurations are set up. And after an incident, you definitely want a penetration test to identify all of those gaps and holes of where the attacker may have exploited your environment. A lot of this is also driven by your own corporate policy. So you definitely should have a policy around what the frequency of your test should look like and what you're considering when performing a test or having an engagement to run a test. Also, you should test just because. This is such a beneficial element to any organization, whether or not you're required or expected, and whether you have specific cadences or anything, just make sure you're getting a penetration test. This is one of the most beneficial elements of identifying where you are the weakest. So who should do penetration testing? What organization should be included in this? We're talking about any regulated organization. So if you have compliance requirements, this is absolutely something you should make sure is happening. If you're storing sensitive information, yes, immediately, yes. If you have physical security requirements, if you've got various areas in your environment that should be secure, if you have badges to get into your office, you should be performing a penetration test to make sure that that's efficient and effective, because you're already locking down that environment. So it is an important area to consider running a penetration test. The various applications that you have. If you're developing applications, you must have a penetration test, because if you're not testing it, I guarantee you the malicious hackers are. So super important if you're developing applications to test those. Anyone that wants to increase their security, penetration test is a great place to start. It's going to give you the most critical information to be able to start building that security posture up. Now, who should be performing these penetration tests? You can perform these internally. You can have your own red team that's actually actively doing these in different engagements. Third-party testing is often required of most of the compliance frameworks. This means it has to be an outside organization so that you're not self-attesting to your security. We recommend rotating every couple of years between the parties that you use to test, or having two separate companies test you at different points throughout the year. This ensures that you're getting different experience, different methodologies that may get applied to your environment, so that you get a more comprehensive coverage of penetration testing. There are also software-based autonomous testing. This is not necessarily the best out there. Like I mentioned earlier, having somebody with experience and hands-on keyboard is very, very, very important to be able to really test the exploitability, but you can deploy some autonomous testing in your environment. As we wrap up, we've got some time for some questions. I've dumped a lot of different information on you. We've run through quite a lot, and I would be happy to dive in deeper to any of the questions that you may have. All right, looks like we might have a couple. So one of the questions asking about some specific scenarios that I've seen as a penetration tester in different environments. This is always fun. I'll talk about a physical penetration test that I did recently. These are really focused on the social engineering techniques, and oftentimes it's just a confidence game. There's a general term out there that you could walk in to any organization if you're in a yellow vest and carrying a ladder. Most people aren't going to question or stop you, and that is a common technique that we use. We can this specific scenario, I actually impersonated a employee of the organization. Now, the organization just had a new receptionist start, so she wasn't super familiar with everybody and super familiar with all the roles. I came in, was pretending to be a visitor from another location, and asked for a badge so I could take up some space in their shared space and get some things done. And so I was given that badge. I was able to walk right in, and I was able to start looking for other points of entry and covering various areas of their environment. I found their wireless password. I was able to plug in some devices to be able to run for their exploits. So it was a lot of fun in that sense. Another question that we've got, have you integrated GenAI into your pen test methodology, scoping, or service delivery? This is a fun new landscape in any organization, is the potential augmentation that GenAI can provide. Sometimes we will use some various AI technology to help us with assessing other possibilities that we may not be thinking of. So it is similar to what we would do in terms of just researching online. How do you exploit a Windows 11 system? We can leverage GenAI to give us some sense of methodology of what that would look like. It can be prompted in specific ways for us to be able to speed up the pen testing process. And that's oftentimes a very beneficial element of just condensing some of those research efforts with that Gen AI that can kind of give us a different approach. It's a lot of fun to utilize that technology in different ways. Obviously, we've got experts that are able to analyze the output of what's coming from Gen AI, and that helps us to make sure that we're not performing functions that are actually dangerous or largely impactful to your organization. So a couple more in here. What do you do when you're a remote cloud-based environment and you're required to have a penetration test? This is a great question. You do have a cloud infrastructure. You do have publicly facing environments, whether that's a server specifically, whether that's the computers that are deployed to various employees remotely. There is an environment that attackers can see on the internet. So you definitely want to make sure your cloud environment is in scope for a penetration test. You can also include in that scope the endpoints that your users have. You may not necessarily need to test everybody's endpoint and their configuration, but at least including a few endpoints in your test can make sure that the configuration that you generally apply to all your systems is tested. Another question, I have a firewall and my IT people tell me that it keeps me secure. What are some ways to get around firewalls? This is a lovely question in terms of it depends, right? The good old answer of it depends. Typically, there's different approaches we can use. So let me pull up a specific layer. So to get around a firewall, a ethical hacker or even malicious hacker will probe your firewall. And so it'll touch all the little ports and say, hey, are you listening? Are you listening? Are you gonna talk back to me? I'm gonna send you a request that says, hey, can I connect? And then based on your response, that'll give me some more information about what I might be able to do. So there are services that you have to have open through your firewall. If you have a fully closed firewall, you're not getting any business done. So even though you have a firewall, you are going to have certain openings that are necessary for you to conduct business. So in the past, we have exploited those specific openings. That tends to be the easiest to get a foothold in, is where there's already an opening. So if you have a firewall and it has some rules to allow traffic in and out, those are the common angles that attackers will take to get in. We're not going to start knocking on the closed doors from the outside. We're going to look at those doors that are actually opened in different ways, but may have different controls. So it's not just, hey, I get to run straight through this door, but we can at least identify which doors might be unlocked. And then we can start figuring out how to get in from there. All right, I appreciate the questions and the time spent today. I am, again, Parker Brissett, If you want to find me on LinkedIn and connect with me, I've always got different content around security and generally agnostic in its applicability across organizations. You may also email me directly if you've got questions about your penetration test that you had done recently. If you've got questions about, hey, I don't know what to scope for a penetration test. Hey, I need a penetration test. Shoot me an email, reach out to me. We'll make sure you're getting the highest quality results from the penetration test. That is a consistent form of feedback we get from our customers, is that our penetration tests are very comprehensive and the reporting done around it is easy to understand and very helpful. And as the last slide we have here, you'll get this. There's different references. So if you want to identify some more specifics around the information we covered, you can take a look at any of these sites. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope to see you again on another webinar series.
Thank you all. If you would take a minute to answer the survey that appears on your screen as we close this out, we would greatly appreciate all of the feedback and suggestions you have for our future webinars. Again, thank you for attending and have a great day.